If much of the world is mystery, the limits are not. In other words, at the limits, things become pretty clear. I'm paraphrasing Cormac McCarthy in Blood Meridian. I'm reading the book right now, and I want to use this quote to talk a little bit about current events and the reason why our portfolio is suffering so much. We had quite an underperformance in the last couple of days, driven by Tesla. And the reason, I believe, while some macro problems such as China are certainly weighing on the stock, it's also the political stance that Elon Musk is taking. And I want to comment on this and share our thoughts. Like I said, Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, there's going to be more reviews of the book. It's probably my favorite book in American literature. He beats Steinbeck in terms of just literary prowess. He sounds like a Tool song. It's a long, winding conglomerate of melodies and poetry and beauty, while the underlying brute force of nature is revealed. So there's some quotes that I came across, something along the lines of people that seek shelter and read and hide are ephemeral, will end up in the primordial mud, and people that seek to build on stone alter the progress of the universe. It reminds me a lot of Elon Musk, and I think, like I said, the main quote that really fits well into our thoughts about the political situation in the United States and as it pertains to Tesla are summarized in, while the world's very confusing, it's not at the limit. This is not even on podcast. It's November 8th, 2022. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is down 25 basis points. The market's up 1.3%. The market's still open, so these things could change. For the year, we are down 53.5%. The market's down 17.4%. We're underperforming by 36.1%. Like I said, the massive underperformance we've had in the last couple of weeks has started to be impacted first by macro, particularly China and the risk that we've spoken about. Let me just quickly summarize. The resurrection of Maoism in China through Xi Jinping is putting risk into everything that China is doing. We have capital flight. It's getting more and more difficult to do business in China, and therefore the risk is just going higher for Tesla with a high exposure to China. It's not clear how this will pan out, but it's just a higher risk, and therefore justified sell-off in the stock driven by that. Apple has a little bit problems like that, but not as much. Now, the other factor is Musk's involvement in Twitter and the political involvement. In particular, yesterday, Monday, so the day before the midterm election, he tweeted that he is for a balanced government. In other words, it would be better if people vote Republican, so the Congress goes Republican, and therefore we have a bit of a checks and balance in Washington. And that has potentially triggered a sell-off. Now, again, it's not clear. I think these things are always very dangerous. We look at the headline news and then try to connect stock movement headline news. I would say that problems with FTX, for example, a crypto exchange, and the sell-off of Bitcoin in the same period of time could have been driving this sell-off also. In other words, somebody blew up some crypto fund or some hedge fund that is in crypto and therefore selling liquid assets such as Tesla. So I'd be very careful in drawing conclusions right away that, because Musk is taking a stance on the political front, that the stock is selling off. Nevertheless, I think it's worth an episode just because these are interesting thoughts, and it's worth discussing the involvement of a founder, CEO of a large company in US politics. So let's parse that. First, what did he actually say? And just to sort of spoil the goods here, I actually fully agree with what he said, because all he said is that we want to have a balanced government because the biggest risk to our country is reckless spending by government. And while I believe that even in Washington, D.C., even despite all the bad rap that Washington gets, I still believe that most people that go to Washington as representatives, as elected officials, and even as bureaucrats, have good intentions, like every other human being. They want to do a good job. And I want to remind people of the book that Michael Lewis wrote, The Fifth Risk, where he goes through government agencies and talks about people in the Forest Service and so on and so forth that really want to do a good job. So I am under the impression that Washington is not full of greedy, reckless money spenders. However, when you have a one-sided power situation like we had in the last 2 years, amplified by COVID, which is kind of a blank check for anybody that can use COVID as an excuse to do whatever they want to do, you just end up in a reckless situation, and that has driven up inflation. And therefore, Musk is saying it is better if we have a little bit more balance in the government, and therefore it would be good if we had a balanced Congress. I 100% agree with that. I have spent particularly my formative years in college and a little bit also in grad school at Chicago, thinking about these things more deeply in an academic sense, so reading papers, doing research. And I believe that we don't have a good way of governing ourselves. We don't. We even the problems in crypto and crypto economics I spoke about last week after my discussion with Tim Roughgarden and his concept of mechanism design, which is the application of, let's say, policy in crypto. Even there, we just don't have good solutions yet. We don't know how to design a system so it really gives us the desired outcome. However, and now this is the gist of the quote. What McCarthy is saying is the world is very confusing, however, not at the limits. At the limits, so in the political sphere, the extremes on both sides, and I would say 20% of people, and let's call them mask-wearing COVID gender fanatics, and on the other side, the the oil-hugging fanatics who'd rather drive a pickup truck driven by oil and be dependent on Saudi Arabia than yield to the new, the better, the disruptive. So those are the two extremes in society, and we know exactly where they stand. I had a conversation yesterday, my partner had a conversation with somebody who said exactly that, who said, well, if Musk loses California, he's not going to win the middle of America because the middle of America are oil fanatics and they're not going to yield to Musk, even though it's a better product, even though it's better, that this country for some reason believes that oil is the backbone of the country. I would say that, again, these are very predictable comments, and the 20% on both spectrums politically are very predictable. And what Musk is saying is that the middle, the 60% that is left, can have common sense, that they can change their minds. Yours truly here first. I did actually change my mind. I was a Democrat for a long time, and during COVID times, I switched to the other side. I support people like DeSantis, not necessarily because I like everything they do, but on certain aspects, when it comes to common sense, this is very important. I don't want my child, for example, to be taught about sexuality in the way that gender ideologists want this topic to be taught. I don't have a problem with respecting people's choice of sexuality, but it doesn't have to be the main topic in school. I am absolutely for wrapping up, I don't know what the word is, but to go deeper into the history of the United States and correct wrongs, such as the former slavery and the current racism that is still prevalent in society. But I am against using that as a political weapon to achieve other goals and to propel, certain people into power just because they hypocritically pretend to care about black people. So I'm all for common sense. So my point is the following. I think that we at Orange Capital Partners, we are actually in agreement with Elon Musk, and we believe that the risk of losing market share in the United States is at best neutral, if not even less now. Why? Because again, the 20% on both sides, you're not going to get them anyway. The tree huggers and fanatics and Fruit Loops, as we call them, so those people who think that we should spend all our time, instead of educating our kids in terms of engineering and math or social sciences and scientific approaches, they should be fed ideological nonsense. So that side, and the other side, which has the same ideological nonsense, just with other nomenclature. So we should, for example, drill for more oil just because oil is some sort of backbone of the country. And even though we, let's say, have innovation. We have the only American car company that produces most of their intellectual property, most of their actual physical property in the United States. All the R&D is done in the United States. The whole company, I'm talking about Tesla, is fully American and helping us to be independent of, let's say, Saudi Arabia and many other countries such as Russia. Instead of promoting that, we hang on to some sort of, I don't even know where this is coming from, but nevertheless, again, like I said, on the extremes, the limits, the society becomes very clear and not very complicated. So the middle is where I think people can change their minds, and they usually do, and they win. The common sense arguments tend to win. That's why democracy actually works. That's why this whole concept works. Because and I call her the housewife in Ohio. I think the middle class, upper middle class housewife, 3 kids, a house, a mortgage, all that stuff. She is not going to be driven by ideology because she's got a job to do. She has constraints. She has a cost structure to live with. She has kids to raise. She wants her kids to be good, productive members of society. She doesn't have privileges on both sides of the spectrum. In other words, she's not part of a fancy country club sending her kids to fancy private schools, nor is she pro-welfare and dependency of the government because she's not really getting anything from the government. She believes that her family can make it on their own. And therefore, common sense prevails. For example, kids should go to school and be taught. And even though there is a pandemic, the risk outweighs the cost of not going to school. Wearing masks should be a free choice by people, and you can't impose how people should dress on anybody ever, because that opens up the gates for even more coercion, and that is very dangerous. We shouldn't have central authority when it comes to things like declaring lockdowns and all those sort of things. Doesn't mean that not declaring lockdowns is the right thing too, but what we need is checks and balances. We need a little bit more market-driven approaches, try and error, like we had during COVID. We had actually, that's why I think the US actually came out very strong out of COVID, because we had success stories in Florida and Texas that showed that you can actually have a dignified society even during a pandemic without the cost that the left was trying to convince us we would have to pay, such as a lot of people dying and all that stuff. And just to finish that argument on the left, if anybody still doubts that some of the approaches in California and New York and etc. were right in terms of COVID and lockdowns, just look at China. You want to live in a country like that where the leadership declares zero COVID and therefore completely locks down the country. I don't think even the extreme left doesn't want that. So having said that, now on the right, the extremes there, and the things that the housewife in Ohio doesn't agree with is, for example, that at all costs we should keep pumping oil and driving IC cars, even though we have better products and more flexibility and more optionality and better jobs and more intelligent jobs and all of that stuff. I have all my utmost respect for the oil industry. I'm an avid consumer of content. I listen to the Digital Wildcatters podcast, for example. Great job, shout out. I'm incredibly interested in what's going on in that industry, and I don't have any issues whatsoever with the oil and gas industry. In fact, I believe that we need a lot more oil and gas because electricity is going to be the key towards an independent energy infrastructure of the future. However, I do believe that decarbonizing the global economy is a good thing simply because it forces us under the constraint of emitting less carbon to come up with new technologies that could potentially be better. I'm against coercion. In other words, you should be able to drill for oil and gas wherever you can under the law and all that other stuff, NIMBY here, NIMBY there. I understand all of these things. But I am against the fanatic who, out of principle, doesn't want to buy a Tesla just because somehow Tesla stands for anti-oil. That is stupid, and that is not progress, and that is not good for your kids. That is not good for their kids. And whatever is not good for your kids or the kids of your kids is not something you should be propagating. So this is my point of view. And therefore, I think, and I believe that Musk kind of thinks the same way. However, the people in the middle, the lady in Ohio with her 3 kids, she's going to sit down and think about, let's say, the schools, and she's going to be probably more on the spectrum of schools should be, we should be able to send our kids to school. She's going to be, and here's the big, actually the 800-pound gorilla in this whole conversation, which is the government spending money. The government is spending way too much money. The Fed balance sheet has ballooned to 9 trillion from 5 in 2 years. And even before that, it has been ballooning. And that is wrong. That is terrible. That is a recipe for disaster. I've quoted Lenin many times on this podcast because Lenin said, either directly or he's being quoted, that if you want to destroy capitalism, just destroy money. If you want to destroy money, just print money, just increase the government spending, and you will destroy the system. So we don't want the system to be destroyed. We're very, very happy with the system of voluntary exchange under free, in a relatively free society, and whatever we call that system, let's call it capitalism, just for brevity. I know capitalism has its drawbacks, and I am not a sort of a robber baron type capitalist by no means. I am a Popperian by nature. Let's try to be able to iterate as fast as we can with as little cost of error and little cost of error correction. This is my stance as I stand politically, and I think Musk agrees with that. Therefore, we are very happy with his stance, and we hope that Washington gets more balanced and stops spending money. Now, having said that, of course, Jay Powell has taken care of that already with driving interest rates up to almost 4.5%. That becomes very expensive for people in Washington to waste money. Therefore, we're already in the constraint, and that's a good thing. Nevertheless, I think it's worth mentioning that also for our kids, because this mentality that you can just spend money and do nothing, not work. I mean, Twitter is the best example. You have 50% of the company that literally isn't working, but pulling a salary. It's just very bad for Twitter. It's very bad for the economy to have that kind of mentality. The people who've been working there and now being laid off will have very difficult times finding a job, not because they're not qualified. It's just because their mentality is, well, I can sit home and pretend to work and should be paid. And it's going to be very difficult to get paid in an environment where interest rates are 4 to 5% and entrepreneurs and businesses get back to basics and common sense. So again, the quote by Cormac McCarthy that society is very complicated, but not at the limit. I think it's a very powerful quote. It encompasses really what's going on in the country. And we're very positive about the middle of the country, actually. And I disagree with my friend who said that the middle of the country will not embrace Musk. I think the middle of the country will embrace Musk because he is propagating common sense. He's propagating positive future. And the middle of the country, which for me stands as a symbol, that means there's a lot of people in California and New York who are having that same mindset. It is not about privilege. It is not about dependency and welfare. It is about accountability. It is about your own ability to drive yourself towards a better future, which is really what the American dream is all about. Thank you.